I'm just kind of going to touch upon, maybe go deeper into a particular topic, which is this whole concept of automated scanners, right? And finding vulnerabilities. I just want to understand, maybe from your perspective, like where do you think automated scanners are helpful? First of all, why would you use them? So if you can just briefly touch upon that, just
Yeah, for sure. So automated scanners also a lot of the time as a consultancy, these services are also sold as vulnerability assessments or vulnerability scans.
Yeah.
And they're just that. They're just a scan, they're just assessments. They're also very useful at the end of the day. Where they are very much useful is, let's say you've never done a penetration test, or you don't have a very big budget, or you want to get the best possible outcome of a penetration testing, whoever you are engaging with, be it in-house, be it external, third party that you are hiring, whatsoever. The vulnerability scanner comes very useful in that situations, basically because when you run a vulnerability scans, they are capable of weeding out a lot of the most common misconfigurations, most common pattern of vulnerabilities.
like what? Like what?
So for example, let's say a cross-site scripting vulnerability, basically, which means is you can inject a malicious JavaScript into the full-fledged, fully built application, web application.
So you're saying something like, when we, like a developer like myself, when we write this CORS or CORS,
yeah,
things like that, those
totally.
are the kind of things.
Even if you have like a CORS policy,
Yeah.
a vulnerability scanner is able to look into that CORS policy as well at some point, up to a certain extent, and be like, hey, you know what? As is on the baseline, there is a misconfiguration. So that's what they're good at. They're gonna tell you there probably is a problem. Sometimes they're gonna tell you there 100% is a problem.
Okay.
The depth of it, they couldn't. And if whether or not that vulnerability is exploitable, they're not always accurate in that situation. And also at times, what I have personally seen is if you have compensating controls. For example, yeah, sure, you are allowing a random host to be added as part of your as part of your header, and it is a part of your regular CORS policy, right? That's how you have implemented it.
Yeah.
Your origin host is you are supposed to add it because you are embedding a lot of different applications. You're trying to give it to many different clients as well, who requires you to have that wildcard origin host, right?
Yeah.
And a scanner going to see it as a CORS misconfigurations because you're basically allowing an arbitrary origin host to be added into the header. However, it doesn't recognize that that is a business case, and in order to protect and whatnot as well, wherever those policies exist, wherever that is allowed, there is no any sensitive information that comes out of that at the end of the day as well, right? Which means, yes, it's a vulnerability, but doesn't matter.
Yeah, I
Right?
get it,
So
because
that's
it's
the
gone through an
area
internal.
that's correct. It doesn't understand the business context. It doesn't understand the application's context, and it doesn't understand when it is not going to be a vulnerability. In that situation, it's not going to be a vulnerability. It can be something that you know as a risk. You're going to have to accept it because there's no sensitive info in there.
So, I mean, okay, so I understand, like, it doesn't have a business context. Now, typically, I think in the cybersecurity world, at least from a development world, I come from a development world, right? I think a lot of us just get into it and say, oh, let's just do a vulnerability scan. It'll probably tell me, what port is open, protect me from that, it'll just give me a thing. And then I do a checklist saying, yeah, I'm okay with this, I'm not okay with this, right? I'm just trying to get a sense that with penetration testing, right, with guided penetration testing that your team does, like let's say a purple team comes in and basically does a guided penetration test, what benefits does the business get out of it? Like, why go through that extra depth? If you can just briefly explain that.
Yeah, for sure. So I explained the limitation of the vulnerability scanners, right? They can scan, but does not understand context. Another big flaw that a scanner have is they are on the surface level really good.
Okay.
However, when it have to go to a very good depth, when I say good depth, trying to build your own custom payload that is very specific to that application, to that business in that situation on all the text that you have.
Yeah.
Scanner cannot do that.
Fair enough.
Right, because they're not smart yet. So that's where penetration testing comes into handy, and that's where the value as well is. You run a vulnerability scan and everything, you weed out all the surface level vulnerability, you fix everything, And when a pen testing actually happens, you're going to force a consulting business to go beyond what scans have because you already would have done your due diligence, right? So that's where the great value comes in. And when a pen testing actually happens from our perspective, from our team's perspective, what we do is we ask you to give us a bit of a rundown of the application itself. Tell us about features, tell us why is it important, what is your common user base like, what do they use it for, how and whatnot, so that we understand your business, so that we get to understand, figure out where the risk is going to look like. The same vulnerability can have different risks to you versus another organization, right? So it's very important for us to understand your business and the context of the application, and your user base as well. And also, the better we know about applications and its workflow, the easier it gets and efficient we get to finding vulnerabilities as well.
Okay.
So after we do that, we then go into, we kick off our vulnerability scanners as well because they're always an ally, should not neglect them.
Yeah.
So we use them as well to go find anything surface level. I'm going deep. So it goes wide, we go depth.
So it's like, okay, so I can see it now. Essentially, even in your role, you do use a vulnerability scanner to weed out the most common things, and you basically then use your time to dive deeper into an application. So for example, if there's a complicated workflow which includes an OAuth integration, a third-party SaaS application integration, your own internal REST APIs, then you would be going deeper in the business
That's
context
correct.
and then basically testing the whole workflow.
That is
a lot more
correct.
deeper and connecting the dots in that workflow.
That is
where
correct.
do you see the risk? Okay, that's an
So
interesting
scanner
thing.
is going to see them as separate entities.
As separate entities.
We
but-
want to see, okay, as a separate, they may be very secure.
Yeah.
Right? But there could be one single misconfiguration in that whole step 1 to step 10 from a OAuth login to eventually reaching a certain API endpoint. We look for that specific mistake. That's step where the flaw gonna exist. So we go utilize, we invoke the whole workflow and keep a record of every single request that goes in and how it is functioning.
Okay.
And then look for, okay, what vulnerability exists here. In case of OAuth, maybe a state parameter does not exist, so maybe a CSRF. So I may invoke an OAuth parameter, send a malicious link to you. I may be able to take over your account for an instance for certain situations. There could be an API endpoint that you can only see after you go through OAuth flow. However, that API endpoint really does not require any authentication.
Yes.
And it's dumping a lot of personal information, right? PII data or PHI data and things like that. Now, I'm also going to go and look into those kind of flow as well. Cool. Although it's thrown after the authentication, but this is accessible before authentication as well without my authentication tokens. I'm going to look for vulnerabilities like that where scanner's going to miss a lot of the times, right?
Exactly.
So things like that, we go in deep, but also we don't just stop there. We also go into, okay, scanner also may have found me 5 low vulnerabilities on the surface.
Yeah.
I also go into the phase of, okay, those 5 vulnerabilities, how would a real threat actor would utilize each of them, maybe chain together to increase the severity and impact on a business? How is it useful for a threat actor? Because at the end of the day, you are getting that report, right? I need to be able to show you why you should care about this vulnerability. So that's what also we perform is any vulnerabilities that we find manually or through our scanners as well, we try to figure out how can we chain them together, like in a realistic way, so as to show if a threat actor knows about all these different vulnerabilities, this is what they would perform in order to go and
so what you're saying is that it goes back to your earlier point, which is the vulnerability scanner is just out of the box. They're not really simulating a real world scenario. What you're doing is you're creating a simulation for a real world scenario, how a threat actor would behave. In your penetration testing, you're basically, you're simulating their actions. You're finding vulnerabilities because of that, and then surfacing it up.